I am really glad to have Aaron Ernst as our panelist moderator today. Aaron leads the Natural Resources Division for the California Tahoe Conservancy. So her job and her team's job is to protect this beautiful place that in which we're meeting. So let me hand it over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Wade. Welcome back. I'm really honored to be moderating this panel, Focus on Wildlife, a vision for vibrant ecosystems. Just to set the stage, I'll be sharing a few thoughts, and then I'll be asking questions of each of our panelists. After that, I'll be looking to the executive committee to ask questions of them as well. So I'd like to start off by giving one example of how wildlife cameras here in the Tahoe Basin are providing new data to inform future land management goals. As you hopefully have seen, the Tahoe Basin is a really special place with unique features, including a variety of wildlife. A majority of the Lake Tahoe Basin is managed by public lands that are managed by a variety of federal, state, and local agencies who have a strong track record of working together in partnership. Through this partner coordination, they found gaps in understanding how wildlife traveled through the fragmented land ownership here in the Tahoe Basin, from adjacent to communities and the wildland-urban interface up into the general forest. And we wanted to understand this better to inform land management. Partners are able to provide grant funding to fund a multi-year study to set up a network of wildlife cameras across ownerships on the California side of the Tahoe Basin to gather more information about where wildlife are moving. We only have 1 year of data so far, with a couple more years to come, but it's already providing really interesting information that can be used at a variety of scales. It's providing interesting opportunities for us to identify important corridors for wildlife movement from the wildland-urban interface to the general forest. It's going to be able to hopefully inform management objectives for land managers on specific place-based projects. We anticipate it will allow for more coordination between partners for basin-wide efforts and priorities, as well as even adding to the state conversation, identifying wildlife corridors and high-priority areas for future wildlife crossing projects. This example is just one way. We're moving from what I might term as business as usual, where we were implementing fuels treatments projects that needed to be mitigated for wildlife or other resources, moving towards a forest health project that has multiple natural resource benefits. And the task force, I would say, is also following in this trajectory to recognize the importance of resilience projects and actions that have comprehensive benefits. For example, this we can see in the task force action plans. The 2021 task force action plan actually only has a single action related to wildlife, habitat, or biodiversity. But the task force has this desire to evolve to large landscape projects to promote comprehensive wildlife, climate, and watershed benefits. And we can see that in the upcoming, the 2025 action plan update that will be more focused on multi-agency, multi-purpose projects that are outcome-based. So how do we integrate these things and move from single species mitigation to a project that has a multiple ecosystem benefit and is more centered around nature-based solutions? Well, what you're going to hear today from the panelists is that's already happening, and we want to think about this work and be able to expand on it. The Sierra Nevada partners are advancing large landscape and multiple benefit projects that promote nature-based solutions broadly. And we want to carry this work into the future and learn from our experiences to develop or update partnerships and frameworks. The panel here in front of you has a diverse backgrounds and are going to speak to different ways that we can think about aligning ecosystem benefits in project planning and implementation through things like planning and monitoring, regulations and permitting, implementation, stewardship and sustainability, and policy and conservation. And we'll be looking at this and talking about it across scales from local projects to statewide policies and strategies. So I'd first like to introduce Stephanie Capetto, who works for the U.S. Forest Service. So Stephanie, you've spent your career, a good portion of it, working here in Lake Tahoe as a wildlife biologist previously, working on interdisciplinary teams and leading those teams for looking at to plan and implement landscape scale projects. In the past couple years, you've actually moved to the regional office to focus as the regional monitoring planner. So given that background and experience, can you describe your experiences and those of the Forest Service in planning large projects with multiple resource benefits in developing monitoring products to assist with those efforts?
Sure, Aaron. Can everyone hear me okay?
Stop talking, it'll come.
Okay. Well, as you said, I was fortunate enough to be a wildlife biologist here on the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit for 10 years. And I can say that towards the end of my time, I was lucky to work on the Lake Tahoe West project, which is about a 60,000 acre project focused on reducing wildfire risk and improving the resilience of our Lake Tahoe's West Shores ecosystems. And on this project, we worked collectively towards achieving multiple objectives. It was nice. Not one resource led the charge on the analysis of the project and developing the project. We worked collectively. We tried to plan treatments that would achieve multiple objectives. Our goals were looking at improving forest health, improving resiliency, enhancing habitat for key wildlife species, restoring meadows, among others. And we've had multiple field visits with partners where we would stand at a California spotted owl site and say, okay, how can we both improve habitat for this species, reduce wildfire risk, and improve forest resilience? So it was a really rewarding experience. And we emphasized words like opportunity rather than mitigate. And I have to give a lot of credit for this to both our leadership and the people that worked on the team, but also the partners that came to the table with diverse viewpoints for values of the landscape that we may not have been thinking about. And this is happening, this approach towards multi-benefit projects is happening at forests throughout the state. And so what you see here is an example of the North Yuba Landscape Resilient Project. It is one of our wildfire crisis strategy landscape projects. It's on the Tahoe National Forest. It's over 250,000 acres. And through a partnership with the North Yuba Forest Partnership, the team identified 4 goals of the project: improve and restore forest health and resilience, reduce wildfire risk, protect communities from high severity fire and climate change, and protect and secure water supplies through restoring watershed process and function. So you can see this is a multi-objective project that's not just focused on reducing fuels. And what's interesting is the partnership came together and they selected the goals from the pillars of resilience that you see there, the framework for resilience, which you're probably familiar with. And the 5 pillars they selected were forest resilience, fire dynamics, fire adapted communities, water security, and biodiversity conservation. Now, I would be lying to say that we are achieving this incredible holistic multi-benefit projects on every project on every forest, right? We still have a lot of progress to do, and we also have to recognize that sometimes this multi-objective approach it doesn't work for every acre, right? You can imagine some acres that are in the WUI defense, for example, right by our homes, may not benefit from multiple objectives. In planning these projects, and as Aaron said, I transitioned to then be a regional monitoring planner, I realized to plan these, we needed data. We needed real-time data on not just current conditions, but status and trend. And so that encouraged me in my current position to build an interactive website. This is our regional broader scale monitoring strategy website. And here a user can go and they can explore data for themselves on a variety of dashboards for social, ecological, and economic conditions on all National Forest System lands in the state of California. And what was nice is I'm learning that forest specialists are using this to plan the projects, to develop a purpose and need, to think about the proposed action. So what you see here are our climate change dashboard, our wildfire severity dashboard, our trend in invasive species dashboard. So this was something that helped me realize we needed to put the data in the hands of our specialists and have them using similar data sources and have it be refreshed regularly. Now, I would also say we still need good data, and I think many of you know that. We have a lot of fancy tools being developed, but we need the data that goes into those tools, specifically for vegetation structure and conditions in the state. Now, status and trend monitoring is great to help plan multi-benefit projects, but what we also need is outcome monitoring. How is what we're doing on the landscape or the disturbances that are happening influencing our resources? And so towards this end, we developed a monitoring strategy for our 6 wildfire crisis strategy landscapes in the state of California. And what this does is it focuses on outcomes, not just status and trend, but how is what we're doing having an influence. And so it looks at major buckets like community and ecosystem resilience. How are our forests changing? Is our forest health improving? Is tree mortality reducing? How is species habitat condition changing? And are we actually restoring resilience to species habitat like we say we would? And then lastly, are we taking an all lands approach, right? That's also a benefit of these projects. Are Forest Service actions helping leverage actions on other lands? So towards this end, we're looking at a variety of benefits from these projects, and as we're doing so, we're working with our partners in the task force to make sure that what we're looking at aligns with the core metrics and the outcome monitoring that the task force would like to achieve as well. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'd next like to turn to Rachel Henry. Rachel, in working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you've collaborated with landowners to develop conservation solutions that balance land management needs with species protection. You've also had experience in crafting regulatory strategies that ensure sustainable outcomes for both landowners and wildlife. Given that background, as forest and fuels management projects increase in pace and scale, why are new regulatory tools needed to support wildlife conservation in balance with wildfire crisis? And what is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing to support these efforts?
Thank you, Erin. Additional tools are really necessary to ensure that we are providing regulatory solutions to really help support timely implementation of these critical projects. We know that natural resource agencies are really facing unprecedented expectations to mitigate the wildfire crisis through implementation, or really increased application of these forest treatment projects. And many times those actions require coordination with wildlife agencies or other state, federal, local agencies. So it's important for us to be providing solutions to help kind of remove that regulatory tape, remove the red tape, if you will, to really help, again, get these projects implemented on the landscape in a timely fashion. As far as conservation value, when implemented appropriately and kind of managed appropriately, these actions in and of themselves have intrinsic conservation value already built into them. They are the conservation tools that are necessary to protect our ecosystems and the species that depend on them. And so through these projects, we see that they promote ecological resilience, they promote ecological stability, they increase biodiversity, making them vital conservation tools for, again, ecosystems and the species that depend on them. You can see this image here. On the left, we have a landscape pre-fire, and then what happened in the aftermath. And you can see that these devastating, high severity, catastrophic wildfires will take these once kind of vibrant ecosystems that are full of life and leave them really desolate, barren, lifeless ecosystems that are it's really challenging for these to actually recover and host species again, and once again be these vibrant ecosystems. I think it also, this image highlights, again, the need to get out to implement these projects to keep these from happening, to really reduce the wildfire crisis and really build that resiliency back into the ecosystem so that it can withstand disturbances. So in response to the wildfire crisis, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been working to develop the California Forest Conservation Plan. It is a one-stop shop for all landowners, federal and non-federal, to voluntarily seek Endangered Species Act compliance when and where it is necessary. We started in the area in orange, calling it the Plumas Tahoe Subplan, and we started there for a couple key reasons. First of which, our Sacramento Fish and Wildlife Office is really leading the pack in working on a lot of these solutions, these programmatic solutions, working with, we heard about the Sierra Pacific Industries Conservation Plan and the good that entity is doing on the landscape. So we kind of really built upon the successes that have already been coming out of that office and have taken that and really just kind of grown it in not just in terms of its geographic footprint, but also the covered species that are included under this plan. plans. We are looking at currently listed species as well as those that might become listed in the future. So in order to really make sure that we're kind of accounting for changes in the future. The way we are building out this statewide permitting program is through a series of subplans. Again, we started with the Plumas Tahoe subplan. It might look a little small compared to where we're moving to next. We were kind of just getting our feet under us. Again, we're meshing and marrying up a few different permitting mechanisms, so we kind of wanted to get it right. I feel like we've got a good template now. That plan will be available for public review and comment at the beginning of this next year. And we're taking what we've kind of put together there and we'll be applying it to Northern California and the Sierra through the development of the Northern California subplan and the Sierra subplan. We do have a informational webinar planned for October 29th, so invite folks to come and learn more. And again, as I mentioned, that plan will be available for public review and comment early in the year. And I really want to highlight that it's draft, and we want feedback. Did we miss the mark? Did we go too far? We really want to make sure that we're walking the line to ensure that we're getting the conservation for species and ecosystems that we expect, but also allowing enough flexibility to not hinder getting these projects onto the landscape. So we want feedback. We want to hear from you all. Again, draft plan and hope to get meaningful feedback on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm next going to move to Rich Adams, who works for California State Parks as the Natural Resources Manager. Rich, you're a registered professional forester and have worked for many years managing natural resources and implementing projects in the state parks in the Tahoe area. These parks are highly visited, they are immediately adjacent to communities, and have been safely burning and reburning in these parks for decades. Can you tell us about your and state parks' history in merging wildlife goals with community protection and forest health goals in the Sierra District's state parks?
Yeah, thank you, Erin. I am a scientist, and I'm also an implementer of prescribed fire. I believe that we need more implementers of prescribed fire, and I'm looking forward to sharing my knowledge and passing it along and keeping the flame burning. And so here is some footage from this week. I'm really excited to share this with you. This was Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this week at Sugar Pine Point State Park here in the Lake Tahoe Basin. Those are my staff in cooperation with CAL FIRE and U.S. Forest Service. And that is some of what we're going to see tomorrow on one of the field trips. After the video, there are going to be some photos of the same area. So we're implementing 3 primary methods of prescribed fire, broadcast burning across an area. What you're seeing here is what we call understory burning. So that's in the understory of a forest. That's the surface litter under the canopy of trees. And to us, that is our mimicking of the natural process of fire. And that's really the vision that we had as state parks from the beginning of our burn program, was to restore the natural process of fire that was missing from these fire-adapted ecosystems. We also use pile burning in the winter, in the snow. So as a fire scientist, I will write a prescription for fire behavior, and it has inputs and outputs. Inputs like temperature, relative humidity, fuel moisture, and then outputs like what you see there, the flame lengths, intensity, scorch height, rate of spread. And we've refined that prescription over the years. It really takes getting to know your specific environment and your piece of ground to refine that prescription and integrate all those benefits. And really, again, that is something that we've held from the beginning, is ecosystem benefits, fuel reduction, preparing for wildfire, wildlife habitat, and all the things that go into what we might call forest health, and that is ecosystem functions. And we've refined over the years, but that's really been our vision on state parks from the beginning. And so there, what you're seeing at Sugar Pine Point State Park, our first prescribed burns, and by that I mean understory burns like what you see there, were in 1984. So a long-standing program. I came into the program in the mid-90s, and there were already outstanding results and an established burn team. And to me, it was normal. I was right out of college learning what we were doing, and we had these leaders who were burn bosses and showing me the way. And I've been there ever since, and I've just been honored to carry on this program. So actually, I'd like to share some quotes from the past that I remember, because I have been there for almost 30 years implementing these projects. And so one of the visions from the early days was, burn and they will come. And that has to do with wildlife habitat, and that we were missing fire as a natural process. And sure enough, after a fire, after a prescribed fire, we would see more diversity of species, new plants that were coming up from dormant seeds, and then with that, more diversity of wildlife. Another early days quote was, "Let fire be the architect." And that was really like a kind of a philosophy of, just bring fire back, and the fire will shape the vegetation, in the natural way. Well, we learned that, letting fire be the architect is challenging, and there are safety concerns. And honestly, we had some fire escape in the 90s. And so we started doing a lot more thinning and fuel reduction and preparing for safe fire. So another quote on that note is, we have to be safe. We learned that. But remember, the burn boss has to push. And that one really stuck with me, because that was a burn boss who had been there for 15 years, and he was leaving in 1999, and he left me with that one, and I've just always remembered it ever since. Another quote on safety, and this is from fire training in the 90s, was keep one foot in the black. And that means being able to get into that safety zone. And truly a burned area, the black, is a safety zone, and it's taught in firefighter training. Well, we can create safety zones by doing prescribed burning, and it is so much safer. We can do the thinning and the fuel reduction and the chipping and the hauling away, and you might say, okay, it could still burn in a wildfire on a windy day, but if we do that understory burn and we take it all the way to a full restoration, it truly is a safe area, because it is black. You can get into the black, and it's a safety zone. And so that's part of the perspective of safety, and also really completing a restoration project, so that it's not just fuel reduction, but if we do the understory burn and we're mimicking the natural process of fire, we've really taken it all the way to a restoration treatment with all those ecosystem benefits that go along with it. Another look back on the past. So I started with state parks in '95, and I was on my first prescribed fires in 1997, right here in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And that year, in 1997, we did understory burning, like what you're seeing there. We did understory burning on 16 burn plots. And so to me, that was normal. And nowadays, it feels like that's a big number to be able to go and do 16 different burns. And I'm talking about in the fall season, before the snow, after the fire danger subsides, and it's tight. It's hard to get 16 plots, but I know we can do it because I've been there, and we can do it again. And so that's really what I want to do, is have a continuity plan, and that is bring in more people who are helping me to implement these burns and carry on the program. All right, thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Rich. I'm next going to turn to Rihanna Jones, who is the Environmental Program Director for the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California. Rihanna, your career has been focused on a variety of conservation and stewardship efforts, including reintroducing Lahontan cutthroat trout to Lake Tahoe, conservation of pinyon pine, the reintroduction of the Washoe cultural fire, as well as more broadly focusing on indigenous stewardship in your homelands and getting Washoe people back on the landscape to care for the natural and cultural resources. And all of these endeavors are necessary because of climate change and colonization. So I'd like to hear from you on your perspective on how does the need for long-term sustainability and management decisions inform your approach to your work?
Thank you, Erin. So I would say in my work, as you mentioned, my goal is to get Indigenous people back on the landscape, to be stewarding their homelands as they have done for thousands of years. Listening to everybody talk is great. It's triggering a lot of things, not triggering, but a lot of talking points. And what comes to the top is partnerships. The Washoe tribe doesn't own a whole lot of land in the Tahoe Basin, maybe less than 30 acres. So of course our ultimate goal for sustainable ecosystem restoration is to have land ownership. So land acquisition so we can continue to manage that land, go back and manage that land, have continued access for our communities. But since we don't own a whole lot of land, having these partnerships with other agencies, with state parks, so we have opportunities to burn, with the Forest Service, our Master Stewardship Agreement, which we'll be talking about on our tour tomorrow. So we have access to these places that were once used traditionally by Washoe people for home sites, for hunting, for gathering. So my work would be to ensure that there's an opportunity for Indigenous people to get back on the landscape. So how do we do that? What does that look like? Last week we had Trex Basic 32 fire training to get Washoe crews prepared to do this type of work. So how do we build that trust? How do we build that confidence with these other agencies? So training a workforce to do this type of work, getting Indigenous people back on the landscape. And we're talking about wildlife a lot, but Indigenous people are also part of the landscape, part of that holistic ecosystem view, and when you remove Indigenous people from the landscape, it suffers. One thing we've talked about a lot is cultural fire, and Indigenous people didn't necessarily call it cultural fire. We've been building a cultural fire program for several years, and looking into our own history, working with other tribes to see what that looks like and how we can honor our traditions while also working in this field, with other agencies that often require NWCG requirements. So it comes back to, a two worlds concept. How do we honor our traditions and still manage to work in the Western world doing these practices that may not be traditional, but we would love to see more traditional practices, more traditional cultural fire happening. But establishing these partnerships, these stewardship agreements is so important so we have access. So in terms of sustainability, I think, we have a project in Dog Valley and our partners are saying when we're done with the project, we hope that the Washoe tribe will be able to come back here and keep it going, keep it sustained. And it's well, this isn't our land, we don't own it, so how do we continue that access? Is that through a MOU? Is that through a good neighbor agreement, a master stewardship agreement? We're not sure yet, but speaking up for these types of agreements, how the Washoe tribe can be available to fill that gap, that capacity gap. Oftentimes, there aren't funds to hire a summer workforce, and we hope to fill that capacity gap by having a trained workforce, getting them back on the landscape. And then also, I think it means so much more to Indigenous people to be doing the work with their own two hands, working on their own homelands, protecting their cultural resources as they see fit. Another thing I like to think about is the 7-generation concept. It's an Indigenous or Iroquois concept where you need to be thinking 7 generations ahead, like how are the actions that you're doing now going to affect 7 generations into the future? So if we have this restoration project, are we thinking about in 7 years what is that going to look like? Does it need to be maintained? Do we need to pursue funding? So hearing, again, other people talk, I think Secretary Crowfoot said having more large-scale projects and funding opportunities. Our department is grant funded, 94% grant funded. We have 20 grants. So how do we get these larger pots of funding and opportunities to do multiple restoration projects where it's not just a stream restoration or it's not just a fuels reduction project, but thinking of the ecosystem as a whole, burning along the stream or providing shade for Lahontan cutthroat trout so they can have cool temperatures in the face of climate change and keep up their spawning habitats. Well, and it's also doing forest health reduction and also getting Indigenous people back on the landscape. So trying to think of it in a holistic with people, wildlife, and continued access. one thing we've talked about frequently is, indigenous people are an endemic species. They're a keystone species to the landscape. So it's important to have people back on the landscape. And then, again, like cultural fire, it wasn't called cultural fire, but you were constantly burning. When you live in that close connection with the landscape, you are seeing things that need to be done. If you see a patch that you always go and collect at and all of a sudden it's covered in caterpillars, it's like, I'm gonna burn this and get rid of these pests. Or, while you're out collecting, it's like you're also monitoring. So it's like thinking of it in a different way, maybe for indigenous people, that having them in this workforce, doing this type of work, it's also honoring their culture and their traditions where they have access to be monitoring these plants, be collecting these resources, and then also, working with other agencies. It's like, hey, I think this patch needs to be burned, or I'd like to see fuels reduction here. Doing a lot of meadow work. Meadows are carbon sinks, great for climate change, and also have a ton of medicinal plants. So focusing on meadows, the Meeks Meadow Project, of course, and seeing how we can get people back on there. So after our fire training, a lot of people were excited to be doing this type of work. I think there's a lot of opportunities to get Washoe tribal members into the workforce, to fill that capacity gap, to be back on their homelands doing traditional work.
Great, thank you, Rihanna. And lastly, I'm going to turn to Megan Hurdle. Megan's the CNRA Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat. And Megan, you have a wide breadth of experience working at like a statewide level or those larger scale levels, both in your current role where you lead and oversee the implementation of California's 30 by 30 strategy and associated efforts, including Cutting Green Tape initiative. And you've also worked outside government agencies, leading statewide conservation programs focused on inland water and working land strategies. With that experience, how have you seen large-scale plans and goals, such as California's goal to conserve 30% of the state lands and coastal waters, help drive the process for evolving land management to consider a host of environmental benefits?
Thanks so much, Erin. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to the task force for all the work that you do and for allowing this amazing panel to be here today. I've already learned quite a bit, so I appreciate that. So the question to me is, how do these large-scale statewide plans facilitate multi-benefit projects on the ground? And so before I jump into what I think are some of the key ways they do that, I just thought I would highlight some of the large-scale plans that impact the work that everybody in this room does. Now, I'm sure all of you have read these back to front and have them memorized, but in case you haven't, just to highlight a couple of them, we've got statewide plans for biodiversity, our 30 by 30 Pathways plan. We've got plans to increase equitable access, getting people back out onto the lands, and that's our Outdoors for All. Of course, you know the wildfire and forest resilience one well, and we have several for climate, from natural working lands to our nature-based solutions. Now, each of these plans have their own targets and goals, right? So 30 by 30 is focused on biodiversity. Outdoors is focused on access. Many of them set forward strategies, actual targets, numeric that we want to reach. But the thing I think we don't talk enough about is the overlap. Each of these plans references the other plans. They're complementary. And so what we're thinking about a lot is how do we advance these projects that are sitting in the center of these plans? And a great example of this is the 30 by 30 document. I happen to lead that, so I'm most comfortable talking about it, so I'll use it as a reference. The core objective of this is to conserve 30% of our land and water by 2030 to reverse catastrophic biodiversity loss. But it also has two other objectives. It has the objective of contributing to climate resilience and mitigation, and it has the objective of increasing equitable access for all. So even within that plan, there are these three shared objectives. Not every project hits all of those checkboxes, but that's the gold star that we really want to strive there. So how do these plans advance the work? Well, the first thing I want to point out is they create the context and the framework to talk about multi-purpose, multi-benefit projects. Secretary Crowfoot, I think you often say it's a big tent. I think after this meeting you could say it's a big hockey arena, right? It creates the spaces where people that are doing this work can come together and talk about advancing projects. Think about how to layer these multiple benefits together. The partnerships that you make in this room, the conversations that you're having will outlast these plans, and they'll outlast any funding cycle. That's the real value of this. The second thing is funding. I think that's pretty obvious, right? Having these statewide priorities and plans drives funding to these projects. So over the last 3 years, the governor and the legislature allocated $1.3 billion to nature-based solutions. Those funds went to contribute to the objectives set forward in these plans, the projects which all of you are working to advance on the ground. And many of the conservancies and commissions and departments that manage those funds are looking for those multi-benefit projects, right? They want to see those dollars go as far as possible. The other thing these plans can do to advance multi-benefit large land-scale projects is they bring attention and they bring accountability. So a lot of these planning documents require annual reports to the legislature, to the public. There's lots of media opportunities. We do our best to try to uplift the stories of success that are coming from here. And it's a chance to share lessons learned. Look at how people are doing it in different parts of the state. Can you replicate that here? What can we learn to do better on these projects? And then the final thing I'll add is these plans often come with capacity. So it has positions like mine that sit within state government who have the goal of advancing opportunities to get these projects done or removing barriers that are standing in your way. It also has resulted where I've seen NGOs or others have actual positions focused on access or focused on biodiversity or getting these large projects done. So I'll just wrap up by giving an example of a project that I think really hits the button on this one. And I've been talking about this quite a bit. I don't know if anyone's in here from the 40 Acre Conservation League, but this is the Tahoe Gateway Project. This is a 650-acre acquisition that was recently done with a variety of public and private funding. It is right along a major highway, so not only is the property going to be managed for biodiversity and sequestering carbon, they're also doing fuel reduction and fire resiliency work within the forest, and it's an access project. So this really has the goal of opening up this space to the public and providing equitable access for people that haven't always had a space to feel comfortable in our forest and on our public lands. And so this is one of those projects that's sitting at that special center of the Venn diagram, and one that we would love to see more of.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And I want to thank all the panelists there for sharing your thoughts on those questions that I had. At this point, I'd like to turn to the executive committee and open up to see what questions you may have for the panelists.
Well, thanks so much, panelists. Really excellent set of presentations and a real breadth. So I think it gives us a lot of fodder for discussion here. I'll kick it off with a question and then just ask others on the dais here to just raise hands if they want to ask a question. So we've heard about the need to move fast on these projects and move at bigger scale. Yet traditionally, CEQA and NEPA, these environmental planning and permitting requirements are sort of the guarantees that projects are not harming the environment. So how do we streamline, how do we move these processes faster? Either, maybe provocatively, certain exemptions to CEQA or NEPA, or streamlining CEQA and NEPA, while still ensuring environmental protection. Because I think I'll just acknowledge that not all wildfire resilience projects are necessarily ecologically based or good for the environment. So we need to continue to ensure that. So how can we move quicker while enabling these environmental protections?
Who wants to start? All right, I'm grabbing the microphone. So one of the ways we're doing this is through the Cutting the Green Tape initiative. This is an initiative that doesn't just sit at California Natural Resources Agency. It covers many state agencies and is done actually in close collaboration with several of our federal partners. And I'm hoping a couple people have specific examples that you can talk about of how that's playing out on the ground. But there are quite a few different tools and mechanisms that can be used by project practitioners, such as a statutory exemption for restoration projects, and a restoration management permit, things that can speed up the permitting process for projects that are lifting up environmental benefits. Some new ones just passed this year, and I'll just put a shameless plug in that there's going to be a series of webinars for practitioners coming up starting in November. You can find out about them through our newsletter or through our social media channels, where you can actually learn more about how to access the specific tools that can help you do these environmental restoration permits faster.
So on California state parks, I would say we're really, really good at CEQA. We're experts, so we're lead agency. CEQA hasn't been a hindrance on state parks specifically. So not the case on all lands, but from my point of view, as an implementer, I really need more implementers. And so to say that, with a little more detail, I'm a prescribed fire burn boss, and when I go out and do a burn, I have a firing boss, and I have a holding boss, and then I have all those resources. And I've seen it where we'll do more than one burn on the same day in more than one state park. And so we replicate that model on multiple parks, and we have multiple burn teams, because when we're in prescription, that's the go time. And so there might be a no burn day, there might be an inversion, but when all the factors line up, it's time to burn in more than one place at more than one time. So I'd really like to see more trained staff being able to provide prescribed fire leadership.
That's really helpful. And just point out that while we've made progress on our prescribed fire goals, we have a lot more to go in terms of meeting our target. So more people that actually know how to do this. So when you have those burn windows, you can burn at scale.
As part of the effort for the California Forest Conservation Plan, because it is a federal action that we are approving the plan, we are required to comply with NEPA. And on that front, we are working on doing a programmatic environmental impact statement that will cover the entire plan area, and that programmatic plan will be used to provide NEPA compliance to each of the subplans that is developed under the plan. We typically own this really kind of, I think mostly is associated with work on private lands, because on federal lands, the federal agency would typically be doing their NEPA, but it does really provide kind of a leg up on providing that again, statewide NEPA compliance. And we are really wanting to take a conservative, holistic approach at looking at all of the activities that could potentially be included under the plan to ensure that we're turning over every leaf. I don't want to leave something outside the analysis that would trigger additional NEPA analysis that would then slow them down. So really just to ensure that we're providing that streamlined mechanism that can be used to tier down to each of the projects that will be approved under the plan, or maybe even potentially outside if we can do kind of a determination of NEPA adequacy, it'll provide that. So really taking that holistic approach to provide that hopefully streamlined NEPA compliance on projects into the future.
It's really helpful. I think Valerie has a question, but right before that, is Patrick, where's Patrick? Is he up here? Yeah. Patrick, can you just give a plug for the working group that's focused on streamlining regulatory compliance to get projects done more quickly?
Yes, we've got a regulatory work group that's building off of the great work on cutting green tape. We are in particular going to be looking at the mechanism, in fact, that Megan mentioned. As many of you know, there's a CEQA exemption for habitat restoration environmental projects. And you'd think that we might be taking advantage of that provision a lot. But in fact, it was California State Parks who has done, I think, the only project we know of that has taken advantage of that. And I think that's a symptom of the challenge that's in front of us. I think there is still a perception that we aren't doing enough to turn what were previously perhaps timber projects or fuels reduction projects into forest health projects that have multiple benefit that can qualify for things like that. They can qualify for exemptions from CEQA, they can qualify from funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board, from Fish and Wildlife, from DWR. We're not quite there yet. And I think to tie this morning's conversation to that, and this is sort of a question for the panel, is to what degree can metrics that better evaluate the environmental benefits of what you're doing, not just the acres treated, not just the fuel risk, can that help turn the needle so that we can both accelerate the number of forest health projects, but also widen the funding pool? We're not going to get where we need to go with funding just from CAL FIRE or the Forest Service. We've got to move towards multi-benefit projects that are funded by half a dozen agencies, but we're not there. So I'd be very interested from you about what you think is what would get us there the quickest way to try to accelerate funding and regulatory support for moving in that direction. It's got to be really hard at the local level. That graphic that we just saw showed 4 statewide plans, but they're single-purpose statewide plans. You got a fire plan, you got a climate plan, you got a biodiversity plan, you got a recreation plan. Yes, they're linked to each other, but the hard work of integration is at the local level, where you guys have to figure out, how do I piece together a state grant here, a federal grant here, a wildlife grant here. So we're very, very much interested in hearing from you about how we as a task force can make it easier local to do what the panel is talking about. That's what we want to get to, particularly between now and the action plan update. A new set of policies that can help accelerate the work so that our funding programs and our regulatory programs aren't a barrier, but are actually incentives to get there. So that's my long-winded elevator speech answer, but that's where we want to go.
That's good. I did hear a question in that, which is our metrics. Is this, looking at environmental outcomes of projects? Will that be helpful as regulatory agencies or land management agencies to whether ensure that it's multi-benefit or even get through the permitting process more quickly?
Yeah. Well, Patrick, that's a tough question. But all of these efforts are definitely helping, and yet, there is no silver bullet answer to your question that I can think of anyway. But all of this is helping to push us forward. I really do embrace the technology of being able to, tap into these resources from a phone or from a tablet. And all of it does truly speed things up. And I do embrace the young generation that is coming in and doing everything on their phone. And so, yes, these metrics are absolutely part of the solution. But my initial thought was, yeah, that's the crux. I don't know.
So Patrick, I'd like to challenge that it's not just the metrics on the back end, but it's how you design the work to begin with, right? Like what makes a project multiple benefit is not when you go out and create a project and then count how many birds benefited from it. It's when you go out and do a project and you think holistically, right? Like what you were talking about of how is all of this integrated? How is what I'm doing as a burn boss going to then help the species that are coming back? So you start with the multi-benefit approach. Then it's quite challenging to measure it, but we do need to measure it so we can tell the story about why this is working and why it's important, so we can get more regulatory streamlining and more funding for it.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I totally agree. With respect to metrics, that looks different for different communities. So if we're thinking about just environmental metrics, maybe the project wasn't as successful as we wanted it to be, but hey, we got Indigenous people back on the landscape. We reconnected them with their homelands. That's a success in my mind, but can you use that as a metric when you're getting funding? I don't know. So again, I think that's a difficult topic to tackle, but just understanding that metrics look different for different projects and different people might be hard to pin it down.
If I may, I would say it boils down to three things: efficiency, mechanism, and collaboration. Efficiency meaning let's not reinvent the wheel every time. So for example, the Forest Service does have metrics on acres of wildlife habitat enhanced, acres of lake habitat enhanced. Granted, those are discrete, but when you look at it as a whole, it might be a good way to start thinking about how we want to measure instead of starting from scratch and asking us to all adopt a new way of collecting these data. Collaboration is key, and I think that's what's happening here if we don't talk about what tools we already have, what matters to us, and how we can plan projects ahead and then think about measuring them. You always have to think about the end in mind. And then the last is the mechanism. And so getting at your original question, Secretary Crowfoot, and your question, we need data, right? We need data and we need good data. And part of our problem in planning and identifying our benefits on the landscape is we don't have trained implementers to go out and do the work. We don't have people to go survey every acre, survey every mile of stream. If we can get really good at remote sensing data, if we can get really good at validation data, then we can help streamline this process for our people. So in additionally creating other efficiencies, for example, starting with what you already have and building upon that.
Doug.
It might be more of a statement, but maybe we can turn it into a question. Locally, and I'm sure everyone's experienced this, air quality boards are the biggest hindrance to burning piles or doing prescribed burns. Obviously, our tribes back in the day didn't have air quality and their regulations. And so, how do we be sensitive to sensitive receptors, but also get the work done? What are the agencies doing to try to change air quality rules to make burn windows be much improved?
We should put Katie in the hot seat for that one, overseeing the air boards, but we won't.
Right here.
I will say that just jumping in, I do think that there's been a sea change. I think that the toxic smoke that California experienced over those 2 really bad wildfire seasons a few years ago really changed a lot of air quality regulators' thinking, in that if we don't actually find, more opportunities to do prescribed burns, then we're going to have this huge scale toxic air for, years and decades to come. So my sense is it's improving, but what you're saying on the ground is probably not enough.
It just seems like, and I think Don wants to jump in, so I want to give Don the time.
So actually, what I have to start off with is one, I heard Rihanna say something that I think is really important, and we're having this conversation about projects and talking about the need for being on the land and interpreting what's going on the land, is that there's a cycle of stewardship that's about maintenance. To get to Doug's point and to the question about some of these things, I think also about the role of Indigenous stewardship, and that when we think about our wonderful and important environmental policies that have all been developed in a time frame when the role of Indigenous stewardship and the role of fire, beneficial fire, weren't recognized, is problematic. And I think the question of how do we integrate this in a framework that uplifts and recognizes Indigenous stewardship, which has been in place for millennia, to shape wildlife habitats upon which the species depends, fails to acknowledge Indigenous stewardship. So my challenge and my question is how are you integrating this into the plans? And this includes the work of the plans that we're developing with the task force too. So I'll put that to the panel, and it's something for us to think about.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, so we have a couple questions out there. On the air quality side, I saw a big turnaround after the Angora fire of 2007. The governors of California and Nevada created a blue ribbon task force, and air quality has been a great partner. I mean, they always were a great partner, but I feel like there are more available burn days really than ever after the 2007 Angora fire. And then, well, on the tribal partnership, so California State Parks, statewide, we have our director, and our director signed an MOU with the Washoe tribe, and so now we have a standing MOU with the Washoe tribe, and we've been working together, all these years, but really more than ever, and we're looking forward to just building that relationship and being out there doing these burns and these stewardship projects together, and looking at the riparian area and the vegetation and collecting cedar bark, and there's just so many different ways that we're happy about that new relationship that's more formalized.
Yeah. Rihanna?
Thank you. I agree. I think, Don, you're 100% correct. It comes back to policy change, and Indigenous stewardship wasn't considered in policy when these policies were made. So is that, the tribes working with lobbyists to say, hey, we need exceptions made for cultural burning. We need assembly bills, Senate bills to be passed that allow air quality passes for cultural burning. I also think we're in a time, yes, Rich is saying, a paradigm shift where we understand now after those devastating fires that we need to have more intentional fire, more prescribed fire. Of course, we're in an area where there's a lot of trees. We love all the trees. There's also a lot of very expensive houses that need protecting. So how do we get our community to understand that a little bit of smoke is much better than blackout sun smoke full of toxic paint and when houses are burning down? I'd much rather have a little bit of smoke from some trees and some grasses and some pine cones than these devastating fires that, can make people physically sick. So again, I think it's a lot of education and awareness, just spreading the word about prescribed fire, intentional fire, cultural fire, to hopefully get policy change eventually. And if I think we just keep talking about it and advocating for it, that again, we're in a paradigm shift where the attitudes are slowly changing to be more acceptable of intentional fire, and hopefully we'll get there within the next couple years. I'm already seeing some changes being made with respect to legislation, so that's very encouraging for what we're trying to do.
You want to go, Megan?
Nope, you go ahead.
I want to bring Chief Tyler into the conversation. Over a decade ago, as I was learning more about the work of CAL FIRE, I was so confused about the term fuels management. because I didn't even understand what it meant. And even today, when we talk about fuels management projects, what we're talking about is trees and vegetation in the forests. So you've done so much to build CAL FIRE's work on these proactive wildfire resilience projects. I want to ask you a candid question, which is, for fire management agencies, you know, how much of a shift has there been from projects as solely fuels management and risk reduction to this sort of multi-benefit landscape health?
So I think we have to go back in time and really evaluate where we were and where we are now. Now, when I started in the Department of Forestry, CDF, the Department of Forestry Fire Protection in '90, vegetation management projects were abound across the state. There was so much work going on for a variety of reasons, including tight budget cycles and tight budget times. Many of our resource management staff were reduced as part of budget reductions. And then we find ourselves in a paradigm that, because of those reductions and lack of being able to do things such as CEQA, the organization turned much into a fire suppression organization. Now, as we saw the large fires of the late 2010s and into 2020s, the administration and the department began investing more and more in our resource management staff, from climate and energy to forest practice to forest health to reforestation. And it's an embracing moment, really, to be able to reflect the work that's going on across the department in that phase, not just in fire suppression. So it has been an evolving factor, really, of bringing everybody back into this space of the importance of prescribed fire, the importance of building our relations with our Native American tribes to make our forests more resilient.
That's great. Well, and I just want to say I've seen so much evolution of that. And I think, you know, what we ultimately want to do is ensure that anybody who's funding a project, whether it's through a CAL FIRE grant or a U.S. Forest Service grant or a Wildlife Conservation Board grant, understands that they need to deliver a project with multiple benefits.
Absolutely.
And so one solution I see is we're not going to be able to melt all of, you know, dozens of grant programs into one, you know, holistic grant program. But if we can evolve these grant programs such that, you know, the folks that get the money have to demonstrate that they're managing for multiple benefits, I think that'll be really important. I mean, I think we're already doing that, but I think that's one way where we actually institutionalize the multiple benefits within these projects. Other questions of the executive committee here?
Well, I do have a question that goes back to monitoring, and Stephanie mentioned that, you know, we need data, and we need to monitor for effectiveness to show that we are meeting our objectives, right? That's how we're going to attract more funding, and that's how we're going to attract more partners. But we can spend tons of money and personnel time on monitoring everything under the sun. So can we and are we developing monitoring plans across all of our jurisdictions so that we're all collaborating, you know, a partnership in monitoring across all of our jurisdictions and meeting, you know, the respective agencies' regulatory requirements for that as well?
Well, I'll speak for the Forest Service to say I don't think we've achieved that yet. I do work, you know, closely with the task force partners on what we're all thinking about in terms of monitoring, and this idea of starting with the end in mind. What do we know? What do we want to know so we can act on it, so we can adapt on it? What's the right question to ask? I will say for the National Forest System lands in the state of California, we've made a real effort to make sure that our monitoring is streamlined and it's asking the right questions, and then when we find the results, we present them to leadership along with recommendations for adaptation. So we're working really hard to change what we typically do with monitoring, which is do it and then shelve the results. right? And they collect dust, and nobody ever reads them, and nobody ever makes sense of them. So that was step number one, and we've achieved that, I think, on National Forest System lands. And I am working closely with some of the other partners on the task force to figure out how we can expand that to an all lands.
As part of the California Forest Conservation Plan, we are heavily relying on the work that Stephanie is leading and the work that the Forest Service is doing to really inform the monitoring that is required under the plan itself. We don't want to be wasting dollars out there monitoring something that's already being done, especially at, I think, a more broad, comprehensive, and honestly better scale than what we would be doing. So I am beyond relieved to be able to use the tools and the metrics and the information that is being put together by the Forest Service to really help inform the plan and the effectiveness of these treatments and whatnot. So it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
And I would just say we have a lot of people participating in this task force who are both private sector companies and nonprofits that specialize in technology. And in this age of artificial intelligence and big data, you know, this is just a recognition of the need that we could use help of non-governmental entities to help us utilize the data, help us compile the data, help us collect the data in efficient ways. Clearly, there's great work happening. I mean, the website that you put together on monitoring is a great example of that. And we need to continue to move further and faster on data. I get a lot of approaches on, you know, data that's compiling on vegetative cover or wildfire risk, and that's great, that's helpful. But it sounds like we're also seeing a need to collect data on how projects are improving landscape health, fish and wildlife, you know, sort of ecological values. So that's just a call of interest that I'm putting out there. All right. I think we are probably ready to move on to the next panel. Can everybody give them a great round of applause?